One January morning in 1889, the hangman's noose at Darlinghurst Jail tightened for the last time around a woman. The case of Louisa Collins sparked the fiercest debate over justice and human rights that New South Wales had ever witnessed. She was the last woman to be executed in the history of the colony. Yet that verdict, delivered after 4 deadlocked trials, became the catalyst for a society to question its own conscience. On a scratched wooden table in the small kitchen in Botany, authorities found a half-empty glass jar. The old label pasted to its side was blurred with faded ink. Rough on rats. More than a century ago, it was merely a common rat poison in many colonial households. But in the summer of 1888, it became the evidence that drove a mother to face the gallows. Louisa had once been a diligent wife, striving to keep her household from collapsing under the weight of debt, and she was also the woman whom the press called the Borgia of Botany, the one accused of poisoning her 2 husbands with that silent powder. Some believed Louisa was only a victim of Victorian society, a world where women were bound tightly into roles so unforgiving they left no room to escape. Her life, from a light-hearted young woman to an exhausted mother, was a long chain of sacrifices and losses. But there were also those who claimed Louisa was calculating. That, in the attentions of Michael Collins, a younger man, she had found a reason to break all her old constraints. That each spoonful of powder, each drop of brandy, was a deliberate step toward ending the lives of those who trusted her. In that quiet room, among the scent of stale liquor and damp mold, people wondered, when it took 4 trials and 36 jurors to convict, was the truth ever truly brought to light? Beneath the gray skies of Botany, Sydney, Louisa Collins moved like a silent shadow, carrying secrets that only the noose at Darlinghurst Jail in 1889 would partially reveal. Born on August 11, 1847, at the Beltrees Pastoral Station near Scone, New South Wales, Louisa grew up in the relentless poverty of a colonial family. Her father, Henry Hall, had once been a transported convict, bearing the stain of a distant England. Her mother, Catherine King, an Irish immigrant, struggled to raise 9 children with thin, calloused hands and a heart worn down by hopelessness. The Hall family crowded together, eating meager meals of potatoes and stale bread, while hunger hovered over them like a persistent specter. In those days, poor women like Louisa had not a single glimmer of promise. Victorian society, with its unyielding codes of morality, forced them into 2 choices: labor endlessly in farms or textile workshops, or marry to secure a fragile roof overhead. Louisa's childhood was a succession of long days spent running barefoot across dry ground, learning to endure poverty and the scrutinizing eyes of neighbors. Growing up in the rural district of Merriwa, Louisa soon understood there was no place in her life for free choices. As the 4th child in a large family, she was often overlooked, quietly taking on the small tasks, gathering firewood, washing clothes, tending to her younger siblings. Yet within that poverty, people began to see a resilient Louisa with keen eyes and deft hands. Neighbors in Beltrees would later recall the young girl with tangled hair who remained calm even when hunger gnawed at her or when her father came home reeking of liquor. But no matter how resilient she was, Louisa could never escape the destiny that society had already marked out for her. At the age of 18, Louisa found a fragile way out through marriage to Charles Andrews, a butcher 13 years her senior. Charles, with his steady occupation, was her ticket out of destitution. They built a home together in Botany, where Louisa bore 9 children, 7 of whom survived those early years filled with sickness and want. Neighbors in Botany regarded Louisa with respect. She was seen as the model of a diligent wife, a devoted mother. Each morning, she rose before dawn, heated water, prepared meager meals, and tended to her children with the patience only those who have faced hunger could ever understand. A life of hardship stretched on for many long years. To many, it was the life of quiet resignation that any woman of her station was expected to accept. When a woman spends all her youth preserving a home, what begins to grow when all her sacrifices no longer bring any sense of faith? In the years after bearing her ninth child, Louisa Collins entered what she once called the shadow of herself. Louisa, with her calloused hands, had to struggle simply to survive. Her health declined. The constant back pain and fatigue drained away what remained of her youthful beauty. The face that had once seemed radiant was now etched with lines, her disheveled hair hidden beneath an old, worn kerchief. By then, she had become nothing more than an unpaid servant in her own home. And a turning point appeared in her stifled world. In 1886, with debts piling up, Charles took in a lodger to help cover expenses. Michael Collins, a wool washer with a self-assured smile and striking eyes, moved into the Andrews' cramped house. Louisa first encountered him on a sweltering afternoon when she was struggling under the weight of a heavy basket of damp laundry in the yard. Michael leaned in the doorway and offered to carry it, his voice soft. "You make everything look so easy," he said, a half smile playing on his lips. For the first time in many years, Louisa felt her heart quicken. Younger than Charles, full of confidence, Michael possessed everything her husband lacked. Over the weeks, their encounters grew more frequent. Small compliments, the way he brushed past her in the narrow hallway, these stirred a thrill she had long forgotten. There were whispers among the neighbors, hinting at a bond that had crossed the proper boundaries. To Louisa, Michael was an illusion of escape, a chance to reclaim the woman she had buried under years of relentless labor. But that spark came with a shadow, the first crack in her armor of virtue. Louisa began to feel torn. She loved her children, would have starved herself so they might eat, but the cage of poverty and habit had slowly crushed her. She dreamed of freedom, yet the judging eyes of Victorian society loomed impossibly large. A woman like her, stepping beyond her appointed role, risked complete ruin. She wanted to keep her fragile household intact, to preserve the appearance of stability, but Michael's presence awakened a reckless hope for something else, a new beginning, a different self. These conflicting desires stirred inside her, drawing her further away. Each stolen glance from Michael, each fleeting moment when she felt alive again, pulled her closer to an invisible abyss where control slipped from her calloused hands like sand. Could the longing to be seen become so strong that it blurred the boundary between right and wrong? The entire Andrews family grew cold in the face of Louisa's sudden transformation. The woman who had once scrubbed floors and mended clothing with machine-like precision now spent her days apart from even those dearest to her. Charles Andrews, her husband of more than 2 decades, had become a ghost in her eyes. A man whose presence was as worn and familiar as the boots he dragged home from the wool scour. Louisa's interactions with him grew curt. Once she had served his meals with quiet resignation. Now she cleared the table with indifference, almost disdain. Her children, still clamoring for attention, could feel the change too. Within the stifling confines of the Botany cottage, Louisa's growing indifference to Charles became unmistakable, a silent fracture widening with each passing day. Her thoughts, once anchored to the family's survival, now drifted toward Michael Collins. Then came the deaths, sudden and dark, creeping into the Andrews household like a fog. Early in 1887, Charles Andrews, who had always been robust, began to falter. He complained of searing pains in his gut, his face growing pale as he doubled over, retching dryly. Doctors were summoned to the cramped house, murmuring about occupational hazards. After all, Charles worked around arsenic-soaked wool, but the symptoms, nausea, weakness, the slow draining of his vigor, came too swiftly, too fiercely. By February, he was dead, his body laid out on a narrow bed, leaving Louisa a widow at 39. The neighbors, though sympathetic, raised their eyebrows in quiet suspicion when they saw her dry eyes and brisk steps as she arranged the funeral. Just 2 months later, on April 9, 1887, Louisa married Michael Collins. By July 1888, Michael too fell ill, his symptoms eerily identical to Charles's. The once sturdy wool washer began to wither, plagued by constant stomach pains and vomiting. He died on July 8, 1888. The community of Botany, which had once pitied Louisa's lot, now looked upon her through a lens of fear. The weary mother, driven to the brink by poverty and neglect, had stepped into something unimaginable. In the dim light of the kitchen where she had once fed her children, a question hung in the air. Was Louisa Collins a victim of circumstance, or had she become the architect of death itself? A dark cloud settled over the barren land of Botany in 1888. Louisa Collins, the weary mother of 7 children, had now become the center of a mysterious case when 2 men, her husband Charles Andrews and her second husband Michael Collins, died within the span of a single year. The police, stirred by whispered suspicions of wrongdoing, began to draw closer. Their boots crept along the narrow streets of Botany. What began as mere doubt quickly turned into an unrelenting investigation. It all started after the death of Michael Collins on July 8, 1888. At first, both deaths were believed to be the result of occupational hazards. Both men worked in Botany's wool washing industry, where arsenic was a common chemical. But neighbors, whose doubts had softened into conviction, began to come forward. A local woman, Mrs. Jordan, told the police she had seen Louisa behaving with an oddly calm demeanor after Michael's death. Her face showed no sign of grief as she prepared his funeral arrangements. Another neighbor, John Jaggers, claimed Louisa was believed to have had an overly close relationship with Michael while Charles was still alive. Their late-night conversations in the cramped Andrews household had caused many to wonder. These statements prompted the police to order the immediate exhumation of Charles's remains. Chemical tests confirmed traces of arsenic in his body. When the rotting wooden coffin was lifted from the earth, a crowd gathered along the fence line, so silent it felt suffocating. A few women clutched their headscarves tightly, avoiding Louisa's gaze, as she stood motionless, her eyes wide as her husband's remains were brought back into the light after so many months. The same poison was also discovered in Michael's body. The detectives, led by Inspector James Martin, descended upon the Botany house. They searched every corner of the cluttered kitchen where Louisa had prepared the meals. They seized bottles, jars, and even a box of rough-on rats, an ordinary household product that contained arsenic. According to the trial records, the police also took direct testimony from Louisa's eldest daughter, May Andrews, who was 16 at the time. May testified that her mother had been cold toward Charles in the final months of his life, often ignoring his complaints about his ailments. She recalled Louisa mixing powder into his drinks, saying it was medicine. In the interrogation room, May bowed her head, her hands clutching the edge of her skirt as she recounted the memory. Though her voice trembled, she struggled to keep her composure. Perhaps she knew that her testimony would erase the image of the mother who had once carried her through days of hunger. Another witness, a local chemist named John Bell, told the police that Louisa had purchased arsenic-containing products on multiple occasions, ostensibly for household use. These purchases, though not illegal, painted a troubling picture. Combined with the neighbors' accounts of Louisa's distant manner and her swift remarriage to Michael only 2 months after Charles's death, suspicion deepened. The investigation tightened when the police interrogated Louisa herself. Under pressure, she continued to assert her innocence, her voice steady but her story fragile. The small room was steeped in the yellowed glow of an oil lamp. Louisa sat upright, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on some far-off point. Each question from Inspector Martin seemed to strip away a layer of composure from her face, revealing something brittle and frail beneath. She maintained that the deaths of Charles and Michael were accidents, perhaps caused by their exposure to arsenic at work. But her calm unraveled as she was confronted with the stark testimonies. In the eyes of the community, she had betrayed not only the two men who had trusted her, but also her role as a mother, the one person who was allowed no mistakes. But could a woman who had sacrificed her entire life for her family truly become a perpetrator of evil? Or was it all a distorted picture drawn by fear and prejudice? The trial of Louisa Collins took place at the end of 1888. As the prime suspect in two poisoning cases, Louisa sat in silence, her eyes fixed on some distant point as the machinery of justice moved forward. The proceedings, which stretched across 4 exhausting trials, were rife with disputes over evidence, morality, and the very nature of guilt, turning her case into the center of debate in a society hungry for both punishment and transparency. The first 3 trials, held between August and November of 1888, ended with juries refusing to convict. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor William Foster, relied heavily on meticulously confirmed forensic evidence to press the charges. They described Louisa as a cold manipulator, pointing to her purchase of rough-on rats, documented by botany chemist John Bell, and her swift remarriage to Michael only 2 months after Charles's death in February 1887. Key witnesses like her daughter May and several neighbors, including Mrs. Jordan and Sarah Baxter, added fuel to the story that Louisa was guilty. But the defense, led by barrister John Want, dismantled these accusations. They argued that arsenic could have come from the men's work, where the substance was commonplace in their occupation. Want criticized the lack of direct evidence. No one had ever seen Louisa administer poison, and accused the prosecution of relying on rumor and circumstance. The deadlocked juries reflected this divide. Some jurors saw a scheming widow, others a desperate mother ensnared by poverty. The 4th trial, held in December 1888, became a battleground of conflicting accounts. A heated dispute erupted over a piece of evidence, a telegram the jury had received during the proceedings, which the defense claimed could have prejudiced the trial. Although the judge dismissed it as irrelevant, the prosecution doubled down on their evidence, presenting timelines that appeared suspicious. They even called Dr. George Martin, who had testified that the level of arsenic in Michael's body far exceeded any possible occupational exposure, to appear again and be cross-examined. Public sentiment was divided into 2 camps, with many voices expressing sympathy. Women's groups filed petitions for clemency, arguing that Louisa's poverty and the harsh judgment of the era against women had made her a scapegoat. The defense portrayed her as a mother of 7 children driven to desperation, but the prosecution countered by pointing out her lack of remorse, saying her calm demeanor chilled the courtroom. On December 20th, 1888, the 4th jury delivered a guilty verdict in the killing of Michael. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the gavel fell. Outside, the public continued to argue loudly. Some condemned the verdict as justice served upon a poisoner. Others saw it as a miscarriage born of moral outrage. Louisa, sentenced to hang, remained silent, her face expressionless as she was led away. Did the death sentence truly bring the story to a close? Or did it simply open a new fracture in the idea of justice itself? When the life of Louisa Collins ended on the gallows of Darlinghurst Jail, she left behind a mirror reflecting the rough edges of morality, society, and human psychology in Victorian Australia. Her story transcended the cold facts of her crime, burrowing into the collective conscience with a persistent unease, uncovering deeper truths about justice, despair, and the price of surviving in an unyielding world. The moral burden of Louisa's case weighed heavily on Sydney. Was she a cold-blooded poisoner, slipping arsenic into her husband's meals with precise calculation? or a woman broken by a society that offered her no escape from poverty's grip. Her case exposed the fragility of absolute moral standards, forcing all to reckon with the question of whether justice had truly been served or merely performed for a judging crowd. Socially, her trial sparked fierce debate about capital punishment, especially when applied to women. The petitions for clemency underscored a double standard. Society punished women more harshly when they transgressed moral boundaries. Louisa's hanging, the last of its kind in New South Wales, became a catalyst for change, contributing to the abolition of the death penalty in the state in 1955. Psychologically, Louisa's story was a descent into the abyss of human desperation. Trapped in the relentless cycle of poverty and duty, she was a woman torn between obligation and desire. Her growing indifference toward Charles, as neighbors testified, and her entanglement with Michael Collins revealed a mind gradually fractured over the years. More than a century has passed, yet the case still leaves an unnameable scar on Australia's legal history. People continue to wonder, was Louisa a cold-blooded killer or a mother worn to exhaustion who finally broke? The answer, perhaps, lies within each of us, in compassion or in the unshakable doubt that refuses to fade. This is Case X. The question that remains, as always, is yours to answer.